The border between Vanthorpe and Ironvale had swallowed more lives than any declared war. So when Julie Dahlstrom crossed it alone, carrying nothing but a sealed letter and her pack alpha's orders, she understood exactly what kind of errand this was. She was not a diplomat. She was not a delegate. She was a message, the kind you send when you want the recipient to know you've run out of things to offer and out of people you value. Magnus Hernes of Ironvale, the Midnight Sovereign, the man who had turned a dying pack into a northern empire, the man who had broken every rival who ever stood against him, was waiting at the end of this road. Julie had read the stories. Everyone had. Brilliant. Cold. Utterly without mercy. And now, she thought, staring out at the black-needled forest closing around the carriage, he is about to own me. She had spent the 3-day journey preparing herself for every possible outcome. Imprisonment, cruelty, public humiliation, a slow death made into a political lesson. She had not prepared for what happened when the clock struck midnight and Magnus stepped from the shadows of his great hall and looked at her, really looked, as though she were the only thing in the room that made any sense. She had not prepared for those 3 words that shattered the careful architecture of everyone's plans. The hall fractured into chaos. Her escorts turned pale. His guards went rigid. And Julie stood at the center of it all, her heart slamming in her chest, her wolf surging forward with something she refused to name, because if she named it, she would have to reckon with the fact that some part of her recognized him, too. This is the story of 2 people handed to each other as weapons. And what happens when weapons decide to choose something different? Quick pause. Comment where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. I've got a lot more coming. Chapter 1. The carriage smelled of cedar oil and secrets. Julie Dahlstrom noticed this the way she noticed most things. Quietly, precisely, and without sharing the observation with anyone. 3 days she had been breathing it. Cedar oil, and the particular anxious sweat of men performing confidence they did not feel, and underneath all of it, that faintly metallic edge she had come to associate with decisions made by people who had decided her life was a reasonable price to pay for their ambitions. Outside the window, Vanthorpe was becoming a memory. Golden fields collapsing into forest. Birch giving way to pine, and then to something older and darker. The black-needled trees of Ironvale territory, which did not thin and did not offer clearings and seemed to grow specifically to demonstrate that the sun's opinion was not required here. Julie pressed her palm flat to the glass. The frost collected around the edges of her fingers immediately. She was going to die at the end of this road. She had made her peace with it. This was the part that would have surprised anyone who bothered to know her. She didn't feel afraid, exactly. She felt something closer to tired. Tired and, beneath that, furious, a low, banked fury. She kept so well managed it was almost comfortable, like a coal that had been burning so long it had stopped needing tending. She had been born, her mother once told her, in the middle of a thunderstorm. Her mother had laughed when she said it. She had a way of making even the worst facts sound almost like gifts. Julie had never fully understood that quality until she was old enough to understand what the alternative looked like. Her father, Alpha Eric Dahlstrom of Vanthorpe, who received every hard truth like it was a personal insult and remembered each one until he could repay it with interest. She had grown up in his house, not with his family, a distinction that seemed minor and was not. She ate in the secondary dining room. She was schooled by tutors who came on Tuesdays when the real lessons were held elsewhere. She attended formal events when her presence served a political function and was requested to stay invisible the rest of the time, which she did without complaint, because she had learned early that invisibility was not nothing. Invisibility was armor. You could watch everything from inside it. She had watched everything. She had watched her half-sister Petra grow up golden and legitimate, and carefully ignorant of everything uncomfortable. She had never blamed Petra for it. Exactly. Petra had not chosen the terms of her birth any more than Julie had. But she had noticed, with a calm precision that marked everything she did, that Petra's carefully maintained ignorance had always cost someone else the price of maintaining it. That someone had usually been Julie. The carriage contained all 3 days of that dynamic preserved in amber. Petra sitting across from her with that particular expression, pity carefully arranged to look like affection, guilt carefully arranged to look like concern, holding her hands in her lap and not quite meeting Julie's eyes. The sealed letter sitting between them on the velvet seat, like a verdict already rendered. 2 escorts who never once spoke directly to Julie, who addressed all logistical questions to Petra as though Julie were a parcel requiring delivery instructions rather than a person on the receiving end of a plan she hadn't designed. She had read them accurately in the first hour. The escorts were afraid. Not of her. Of the moment they'd have to hand her over and be responsible, even briefly, for whatever happened next. She had almost felt sorry for them. She had saved the feeling for someone who had earned it. The frozen ground crunched under her inadequate shoes, and she refused to wince. She had learned this young. If you gave people your discomfort, they took it as permission to cause more. You kept your face arranged into something neutral and your back straight, and you looked, always, slightly above whatever was frightening you. Not at it. Above it. As though the frightening thing were beneath your full attention. Ironvale Keep was not a building designed to be beneath anyone's attention. It rose from the black tree line like something the mountain had been persuaded to release after long negotiation. Black stone, genuinely, specifically black, the kind that suggested the rock had been chosen for its color rather than simply quarried. Iron spires. Torch brackets lining the outer wall at intervals precise enough to be deliberate, their fires burning a cold orange that gave light without warmth. The gates stood open. Above them, carved into the lintel in letters larger than her head, Ironvale. Claimed and kept. She walked through them without stopping. The great hall was designed to make you feel small. This was not an accident. Julie catalogued it methodically as she was escorted inside. The ceilings vaulted to a height that served no practical purpose, the torch brackets positioned to throw dramatic shadow rather than useful illumination, the floor a single continuous expanse of black stone interrupted only by the long runner of deep crimson. Guards in dark armor lined both walls. Not decorative guards. Working guards. The kind whose eyes tracked movement. She was made to wait. The escorts shuffled and did not look at her. The guards did not move. The torches burned in their brackets. Somewhere far above, a clock, old, iron-framed, counted the minutes. Julie stood in the center of the crimson runner and did not fidget and breathed evenly and watched everything. The clock struck midnight. The doors at the far end of the hall opened. Magnus Hernes stepped out of the darkness as though he'd been assembled from it. He was taller than she'd calculated from the dossiers. She'd mapped his measurements and somehow still been wrong. The way you could read every word of a storm's description and still be unprepared for what it felt like to stand in it. Dark hair, dark coat, a face that was somewhere between beautiful and devastating in the particular way of people who had learned to weaponize every quality they possessed. He moved without hurry, without performance, like a man who had already decided every outcome in this room and was simply attending its conclusion as a formality. His eyes found hers across the full length of the hall. Everything stopped. She had been prepared for cold calculation. She had been prepared for contempt. She had not been prepared for the way he looked at her, as though she were the only thing in the room that made any sense. As though the guards and the escorts and the 2 packs worth of assembled politics were wallpaper, and she was the only thing with color. Her wolf, the broken, tentative, half-formed wolf she had given up expecting anything from, lurched forward in her chest like it was trying to get out of her ribs. She told it firmly to be quiet. Magnus Hernes crossed the hall at a pace that suggested he was not walking toward her so much as toward a conclusion he had already reached. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the exact shade of his eyes. Dark, almost black, complicated in a way she didn't have vocabulary for yet. He looked at her for one long, deliberate moment. Then he turned to face the room, the guards, the escorts, the gathered witnesses whose plans had all presumably been assembled around a different ending, and he spoke 3 words in a voice that carried to every corner without being raised. The hall exploded. Julie stood perfectly still in the center of it. She heard her escort's protests, strangled, urgent, rapidly escalating. She heard the shift in the guard's posture, the sound of weight redistributing across stone floors as 40 people recalculated every assumption they'd walked in with. She heard, somewhere behind her, Petra's sharp intake of breath. Magnus Hernes was still looking at her, not at the chaos he'd created. At her. Julie Dahlstrom looked back at him. She had been prepared for every possible outcome of this evening except one, that she might survive it. Her wolf pressed against her ribs again, and this time she didn't have the certainty to stop it. She filed that information away under problems to solve later. There were, suddenly, a great many of those. Chapter 2. She woke to sunlight she did not trust. It came through windows that were too tall and too clean, fell across bedclothes that were too fine, and landed on a ceiling carved with the kind of architectural detail that people only include when they have decided that beauty is a statement of power. Julie lay still for several seconds, cataloging the room before she moved a single muscle, a habit so deeply ingrained it had stopped feeling like a choice years ago. Stone walls dressed in tapestries the color of deep water. A fireplace wide enough to stand in, already lit, burning without crackle in the particular way of fires that have been tended by someone who does not want to be heard. A wardrobe that had, overnight, acquired contents. A breakfast tray on the side table that smelled aggressively of actual food. She sat up. These were the previous queen's rooms. She had read about them in the dossiers. Magnus Hernes had stripped the suite after his predecessor's mate fled north 3 years ago and left it empty, as if the vacancy were intentional, as if he'd been keeping it. The gesture was either meaningful or calculated to appear meaningful, and she could not yet determine which. And the fact that she could not yet determine which was itself information she filed away carefully. The maid arrived at the precise moment Julie had finished assessing the wardrobe. She was small and direct and introduced herself as Sigrid without flourish, and then she treated Julie with a warm, uncomplicated competence that Julie found more disorienting than any cruelty would have been.
No careful neutrality.
No performed deference. Simply, quietly, kindness. Julie stood very still while Sigrid helped her dress in clothes that actually fit, which was not a thing she had reliably experienced, and tried to identify the catch. There wasn't one. That was the problem. Magnus came to her that night. He knocked. This was the first surprise, that he knocked. He was the alpha of this territory. This was his keep. She was technically his claimed, and he stood outside her door and waited until she said come in, which she did after a pause long enough to establish that she had considered not saying it. He was different alone. The formal coldness of the great hall stripped back to reveal something that might have been exhaustion or honesty, or both. He sat in the chair by the fire without asking permission, which she supposed was the counterbalance to knocking, and he looked at the flames for a moment before he looked at her. "Your father sent you here to die," he said. "Not as an accident, as a trigger. The letter you carried, if you had opened it, you would have found a formal declaration of aggression signed in Van Horp's seal. You were never a peace offering. You were a lit fuse. Your death would have given him the justification he needed to declare war and the sympathy of every neutral pack in the North." Julie listened to this without expression. Then she said, "How long have you known?" 3 months. "And you waited." "I had to be certain I was correct. And I had to know who was carrying the letter, whether you knew what you were carrying. And now you know." "Now I know." He looked at her steadily. "You didn't know." She pushed back, methodically, precisely, testing every angle of what he was saying, the way she tested everything, because things that sounded true often were, which was the worst possible reason to stop checking. His account was internally consistent. His effect was not that of a man performing honesty. It was the affect of a man who found performing honesty unnecessary, because the truth was already on his side. That told her something. She asked the question no one else had dared. Magnus went very still. The fire crackled. Outside, far below, she could hear the sound of wolves moving through the estate grounds, the quiet patrol of a pack that functioned. Then he said, "You shouldn't. Not yet." He rose. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to consider that your options at this moment are somewhat limited, and that I have, so far, not given you cause to run." He paused at the door. "I'll give you cause if it happens. I'd rather it didn't." He left. Julie stood at her window watching wolves run through the moonlit forest below, silver shapes moving between black trees with a purposeful ease that her own wolf had never once managed. Her wolf pressed against her ribs with an urgency she could not explain and refused to examine. She stayed at the window a long time. She did not sleep well. She did sleep, which was more than she had expected. In the morning, Sigrid brought breakfast again and said nothing that required a response, and Julie ate everything on the tray for the first time, because she had decided the night before that conserving energy for a fight she was already in was more useful than refusing food out of pride. She had survived 18 years at her father's house by being smarter than the room. This room was larger. She would simply have to think faster. Chapter 3. Breakfast in Magnus' private dining room felt like being let into a room most people never saw. Not because it was especially grand. By Iron Vale standards, it was almost plain, a round table in a tower room with windows on 3 sides and a view of the forest that extended to the horizon, but because he clearly used it as a room in which to actually exist rather than to be seen existing. There were books on the windowsill, papers on the side table, a cold cup of coffee that suggested he had been there already for some time before she arrived. He did not make the morning feel like a negotiation. This was the second thing about him she had not anticipated. She had expected the breakfast to be a strategic session disguised as a social one. Instead, it was quiet.
He ate. She ate.
He asked, without apparent agenda, whether she'd slept, and when she said adequately, he nodded, as though that was an acceptable answer, and didn't press it, and this told her several things about him simultaneously. After breakfast, they walked the estate grounds. The air was cold enough to see, and the frost had not yet fully lifted from the grass, and Magnus walked with his hands behind his back in the manner of someone who had learned to move through their own territory without performing authority at it. He began talking about her mother. Julie stopped walking.
"Keep moving," he said.
"What I'm about to tell you will be easier if you're moving." She kept moving. Her mother's name had been Laura. Not a servant, not a nobody, the last surviving daughter of a rare Nordic bloodline, a lineage of healer wolves whose existence had been systematically hunted for 2 centuries by people who understood what they were and feared it. The Blood Moon line, ancient, specific, capable of something no other bloodline in the north could do. Break any curse, close any wound, restore what had been unmade. Julie was never a bastard accident, Magnus said. He kept his voice level. She was a target. Your father found Laura when she was already running from the people who had killed the rest of her line. He offered her protection. She took it and spent the next 2 years watching him study her, document her abilities, and begin to understand what a daughter of her bloodline might be worth. Julie walked. The frost crunched under her boots. The cold did not feel cold. He didn't love her, she said. It was not a question.
No.
He loved what she carried. And when he had extracted enough information to begin his experiments, she became inconvenient. There was an accident.
He paused.
There wasn't. Julie stopped again. This time she did not start walking when he told her to. She stood there for a moment with the frost and the silence and the specific weight of a truth she had always half known landing in the place where she'd always kept it at bay. Then she said, very quietly, "Tell me the rest." He told her the rest. Magnus Hernes was dying. A curse activated 5 years ago when he killed his predecessor, a man named Ulfric who had been slaughtering innocents systematically for 3 years while his court looked away. Magnus had looked at the situation and made the only decision he could live with making. The curse, apparently, did not care about motivation. It had been filling his veins with winter ever since, slowly, inexorably, turning his blood to ice 1 degree at a time. 5 years, Julie said. 5 years. He looked out at the forest. It moves slowly. I have perhaps 1 more year before it reaches my heart. She thought about the coldness of his skin, the specific quality of it that she had noticed in the Great Hall, not the cold of someone standing in a cold room, but something structural, something underneath. She already knew the answer to her next question. She asked it anyway. Magnus looked at her without flinching. Partially, he said. There's something else. But you haven't earned that answer yet, and neither have I. Julie stared at him for a long moment. He met her gaze with the steady patience of someone who had decided to be honest and was waiting for that decision to be evaluated fairly. She had spent a great deal of her life reading people who were lying to her. She was very good at it. He was not lying. That did not mean he was telling her everything. Those were different things. "What do I get?" she said, "in exchange?" He raised an eyebrow. The first time she'd seen his expression shift towards something that was almost, not quite amusement. Protection. My name, which in this territory is worth a considerable amount. Intelligence about your father's plans. All of it. Everything I've gathered over 3 years. And when this is over, he said, whatever you want. Freedom. A territory of your own, if that's what you're after. I don't collect people, Julie. I'm asking for a partnership, not a sentence. She looked at him for a long time. The forest was very still. Somewhere far to the north, a wolf was howling, clear and high and alone. I'll think about it, she said. She was already thinking about it. She had been thinking about it since the moment he spoke her name. Chapter 4. He asked her to come to the North Tower after dark, and because she had decided the previous evening that thinking about it, and then continuing to think about it was not a strategy, she said yes. The tower room was not what she expected. She had been building Iron Vale's interior geography in her mind over the past several days, mapping the corridors she was permitted to use, estimating the ones she wasn't, constructing a mental floor plan from the information available to her through observation and the small daily inconsistencies in where guards were stationed. The North Tower had registered as administrative, secure, probably containing sensitive documents, access restricted. She had been correct about the documents. She had not been prepared for the scale of them. Maps. Letters. Alliance agreements in her father's handwriting. She recognized his hand the way you recognize a scar, by the specific shape of the damage. Troop coordinates. Supply routes. Attack timelines written in the careful neutral language of people documenting plans they intend to execute and want deniable later. 3 years of meticulous preparation. She moved through the room slowly, reading everything, her face arranged into the expression she wore when she was processing something too large to immediately accommodate. Neutral, precise, only the slight tension around her eyes indicating that anything was moving behind it. "He's been planning this since before he sent me to you," she said. "He's been planning this since the year after your mother died." The treaty negotiations were theater. Every peace envoy Vanthorpe sent to us over the past 3 years was gathering intelligence. She kept reading. The correspondence with 3 rival pacts, formal agreements signed and sealed. The communications with something referenced only as the Southern Arrangement, which took her a full 30 seconds to decode as a slavery operation, the scale of which made her go very still for a moment before she continued. The map of the border vulnerabilities. The annotated timeline that tracked Magnus' curse progression with the same clinical detachment her father applied to livestock management. He had been tracking the curse. He had known about it for years. And then the final document. She read it twice. Then she set it down. "He was going to make me the hero," she said. Her voice was very flat. "After. He was going to credit me with the kill. Give me the legitimacy I was always denied. Make it look like I'd done it willingly, gone in as an operative, served my pack faithfully." She set the letter down on the table, and everyone would have believed it, because no one ever looked at me closely enough to consider that I might have been sent here without being told what I was carrying. Magnus said nothing. He was watching her with the careful attention of someone who understood that there were moments when silence was the only kind of honesty available. Julie stood very still. The candles burned. Outside the window, the black forest stretched to the horizon. She was thinking about her mother, about a woman who had run from people who wanted to weaponize her blood, and found protection with a man who had simply wanted to do the same thing more slowly, more carefully, with better paperwork. She was thinking about the years Laura must have spent watching the trap close, understanding it too late to get out. She was thinking about whether her mother had known, at the end, that her daughter was already inside the next version of the same cage. "There's a vault," Julie said. She heard herself say it from a small distance, as though she were listening to a version of herself that had made a decision slightly before she had consciously made it. "Beneath the main house in Vanthorpe. A room my father goes to every night. Locked with symbols I've seen before, on my mother's things. The few she left. If proof exists anywhere of the full scope of what he's been doing, it's there." Magnus extended his hand across the table. "Partners?" Julie stared at it for a long moment. Then she took it. His skin was cold, colder than anything living should be, cold that had depth to it, winter stored in the bones. But his grip was steady. Completely, entirely steady.
Partners, she said.
She did not let go immediately. She wasn't sure either of them did. Chapter 5. 2 weeks of preparation. That was what the mission required. 2 weeks to build the cover, arrange the logistics, map the approach routes, account for the guard rotation changes her father implemented every fortnight. 2 weeks in which Julie became, quietly and without fully intending to, someone who ate dinner with Magnus Hernes and found it the steadiest part of her day. She noticed the change the way she noticed most changes that happened to her, by cataloging it from a slight distance, describing it to herself in the most neutral terms available, and then examining it for danger, until she was satisfied she'd identified all of the ways it could hurt her. This process took several days. At the end of it, she had not identified a satisfactory exit, which was either reassuring or alarming, and she had not yet decided which. He told her about his mother. Her name had been Astrid, and she had died when he was 11, and he still talked to her portrait on the 3rd floor when he thought no one was watching, a habit he disclosed with the same dry matter-of-factness with which he disclosed everything, as though he had decided that shame was a resource he didn't have sufficient time left to spend. His mother had been a botanist. There were still greenhouses she'd built attached to the east wing, still tended by the same groundskeeper she had hired 30 years ago, who was now very old and had strong opinions about soil acidity that Magnus deferred to completely. He told her about Ulfric, not just the killing, the before of it. The man who had been his alpha and his teacher and, for a period, the closest thing to a father he had known, before Julie's father turned him with money and territory and the particular appeal of power that has stopped requiring justification. The 17 innocents. The nights Magnus had spent trying to find another option. The specific quality of the grief of being the person who runs out of alternatives. I don't regret it, he said. I want to be honest about that. I would do it again. But I think about them, the 17. I think you don't get to not think about them if you're paying attention. Julie told him things she had never told anyone. Not the narrative version, the cleaned-up one she had occasionally deployed as misdirection when people got close enough to ask, but the actual version in pieces, in the order they surfaced rather than the order they made sense. The library she had built by stealing books, one at a time, from rooms she was not supposed to enter, shelving them in a hollow behind a panel in her bedroom wall, and reading them by candlelight after everyone else was asleep. The wolf she could never fully shift into, the incomplete, halting thing that manifested sometimes when she was frightened or alone, never fully formed, never reliable. The thing her father had called her greatest proof of inadequacy.
Magnus lyste ned.
He did not offer her the shapes that people usually offered when they were listening, the nods of understanding that functioned as punctuation for their own incoming responses, the sympathetic expressions that were really about managing their own discomfort with what was being said. He simply listened, with the complete, direct attention of someone who had decided that what she was saying was worth hearing and required nothing added to it. The wolf isn't broken, he said when she was finished. I can't shift.
You shift partially.
There's a difference between a thing that's broken and a thing that's been suppressed so consistently for so long that it has stopped trying. He looked at her steadily. It hasn't stopped trying. It's been trying to reach me since you walked through the gates. Julie looked at her hands. That's a problem. Why? Because it means there's something happening that I don't fully understand yet, and I generally try not to commit to things I don't fully understand. And yet you took my hand 4 days ago. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that expression she was beginning to recognize, not the formal coldness of the great hall, not the careful opacity of their early conversations, but something quieter and less defended. Something that was either extremely dangerous or exactly what it appeared to be. She had not yet decided which. She was aware that she might be running out of time to make that determination from a safe distance. One evening, the 10th day, she would remember later, she placed her hand over his where it rested on the table between them. His skin was winter cold. He didn't pull away. He didn't move at all, as though any movement might frighten the moment off. The fire burned. The wolves moved outside in the dark. She said, "I'm nobody special." He said, "You're wrong. You just haven't realized it yet." That night, Julie lay awake for a long time. Her wolf was contentedly quiet, not suppressed, not struggling, simply still, in the way of animals that have found a place they recognize. She did not try to silence it. She wasn't entirely sure she could have, even if she'd wanted to. That was a problem too. She was collecting quite a number of those. Chapter 6. They entered Vanthorpe territory at midnight, moving through passages Julie had memorized as a child, the servant corridors behind the kitchens, the drainage tunnel beneath the east wing that the household staff had stopped checking in winter because it flooded in spring, and they assumed it was blocked the rest of the year. It was not blocked. She had known this for 11 years and had kept the knowledge folded small and ready. Magnus moved through the dark with a silence that was not natural, or rather, was natural to a different kind of creature than the one performing it. She had noticed over the past 2 weeks that he had stopped pretending to be warmer than he was and started simply being precise about it. His body temperature was not human. His night vision was better than hers. He navigated the unlit passage behind her without once touching a wall, which she tested by narrowing the gap between her shoulder and the stone, and watching him not brush against it. The vault door was in the cellar beneath the main house, accessed through a wine storage room she had only seen once, the time she was 8 years old and had followed her father in the dark, knowing she was not permitted, unable to stop the part of her that had always believed the most important information existed in the rooms she was specifically told not to enter. She had seen the door. She had seen the symbols on it. She had not, at 8 years old, understood what the symbols meant. She understood now. They were her mother's bloodline marks. Old writing, older than the current pact system, older than the Northern Territories as they'd been drawn and redrawn over centuries. The kind of writing that belonged to a time when bloodlines were understood to be not just hereditary but architectural, part of the structure of how certain kinds of power moved through the world. The pendant, Magnus said quietly behind her. She had been wearing it since the morning Sigrid had found it in a small wooden box tucked into the wardrobe lining. Placed there, she now understood, not by accident. Her father's wife had pressed it into her hands 7 years ago and said only that it had belonged to someone who loved her, and Julie had worn it folded close against her skin ever since because she had had very few things that fell into that category, and she had learned to keep them close. She held it to the door, pressed her thumb to the iron setting, where the metal was shaped in a way she now recognized as calibrated, designed to draw blood from a specific source. The small bright pane. The door, in absolute silence, opened. What was inside was worse than either of them had prepared for. Her father had been collecting the bones of people like her mother for decades. The shelves that lined the vault walls held specimens, cataloged, labeled, dated, in the careful language of someone who considered what he was doing science. The journals filled 3 shelves of their own, thick volumes documenting experiments that had run simultaneously with her childhood, parallel to every meal in the secondary dining room and every Tuesday tutor session and every formal event at which she had been strategically present and then strategically erased. She read without stopping. Magnus read beside her. Neither of them spoke. The final pages revealed the endpoint, a substance her father had called the inverse. Concentrated blood moon essence, destabilized through a process she did not have the background to fully follow, but the results of which were documented in 3 clinical paragraphs. 1 drop in a cursed wolf's bloodstream. Death within hours rather than years. Complete acceleration of whatever curse was already present. Her father had been counting on Magnus' curse, pulling him toward Julie's blood. Because that was what cursed wolves did. The magic that bound them sought the thing that could heal it with an animal magnetism that couldn't be reasoned with. He had understood this. He had planned for it. He had turned a natural bond into a guided weapon, and Julie was never supposed to be in the room when she found out. She became aware of the silence in the vault before she heard the sound that broke it. Something in her, the part that had survived 18 years by reading runes before they turned, registered the absence of the draft from the passage above. The passage had been open. Now it was not. Magnus went very still beside her. Her father's voice came from the vault entrance, and Eric Dahlstrom stood in the doorway with 12 armed guards behind him, and the specific expression of a man who had anticipated this moment and found his anticipation confirmed. He looked, if anything, pleased. The kind of pleased that had nothing to do with joy. Chapter 7. Eric Dahlstrom was the kind of powerful man who had learned to express confidence through stillness. The stillness of someone who believed every exit in the room was already covered. He stood in the vault entrance with his 12 guards and his amused expression, and he said, "I expected you a day sooner, honestly. You always were thorough." The last part directed at Julie, with the particular quality of approval that he had occasionally deployed when it cost him nothing and functioned as a reminder of its usual absence. Julie did not respond. She was already reading the room. 12 guards. Armed blades, not projectiles, which was a choice made by people who wanted the mess contained. The entrance was the only exit she'd mapped coming in, but she knew the vault's dimensions now, and one of the document shelves along the left wall was shallower than it should be given the thickness of the stone. There was a door behind it. She had not had time to investigate it, but it was there. Magnus moved first. Not recklessly, precisely, in the way she had noticed he did everything, with the efficiency of someone who had identified the 3 most important targets in a room and was addressing them in order. The first guard went down before Julie had fully registered that he was moving. The second with a speed that confirmed that whatever the curse was taking from him, it had not yet taken this. She moved. Her wolf came with her, and this time it did not halt. She did not shift completely, not the full transformation that remained always just beyond her reach, but she shifted enough. Faster than human. Stronger. Moving through the chaos of the vault with an instinct she had always possessed and never once been able to fully access, as if 2 weeks of proximity to Magnus had been quietly unlocking something she'd been told was locked for good. She moved like she had trained for this. She had not trained for this. She understood, in the specific clarity that comes in the middle of a fight, that this was not training. This was the wolf knowing what to do, and the person being willing, finally, to let it. Eric Dahlstrom had not moved from the doorway. He watched the fight with the expression of a man watching a calculation go slightly differently than planned while still believing in the fundamental correctness of the equation. He had not expected her to fight like this. She could see it in the recalibration happening behind his eyes. Good. She had been invisible for 18 years. It was useful to still be underestimated. The last guard went down. 12 armed men, and it had taken, she estimated, from the state of her breathing, under 4 minutes. Magnus was bleeding from a cut along his forearm, minor. She was not bleeding. Her father stood disarmed and surrounded, and he looked at her for a long moment, and then he smiled, which told her everything she needed to know about how many contingencies he still believed he had. "You're going to find," he said, "that things are not as resolved as they appear." She said, "Put him with the guards." Two of Magnus' wolves who had come through the secondary entrance. She had known about the secondary entrance. She had simply not mentioned it to her father, moved forward. Magnus pulled her aside, his hand on her arm, cold, steady. The fight had cost him. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the specific stillness of someone managing pain, the way his breath was slightly more controlled than it needed to be if he were not managing something. She turned to face him. "How bad?" He said something she was not prepared for. His voice had a quality she had heard from him in the quiet of the estate and never in a context like this. Stripped of calculation, stripped of strategy. It broke slightly on the first word. His body went rigid. His eyes widened. Not the expression of a man finishing a sentence, but of a man discovering something happening to him from the inside. His hand on her arm went from warm cold to ice in the span of a heartbeat. The frost she had seen on his lips in the early mornings appeared now, in the vault's lamplight, with a sudden violence that was nothing like its usual gradual progress. He collapsed. Julie caught him. She had not known she would until she was already doing it, already lowering him to the stone floor, already pressing her hands to his chest, already feeling the cold radiating from him like he was not a person with a temperature problem but a window left open in winter. The curse was accelerating. She had read the journals. She knew what this meant.
Magnus.
She kept her voice level. She kept her face level. She kept every single thing in her level, while something that was not level at all moved through her chest. "Magnus, stay with me." His eyes found hers. Ice dark. Still there. Still him. Still, just barely, holding. Chapter 8. She had read about the bond. In the dossiers, in the journals, in the careful documentation of her father's experiments that was also, inadvertently, a record of everything he had not understood about what he was studying. The bond between blood moon wolves and their mates was not metaphorical. It was architectural, a completion of something that could not be finished in halves. He had claimed her in the Great Hall, and she had not finished the claiming, and the curse was accelerating because the bond was half-built, and a half-built bridge held no one. She knew what she had to do. She had known since the 3rd page of the vault journals. She had been hoping it would not come to this specific moment in this specific way, which was, she now recognized, the kind of hoping that was really just postponing. The issue was not knowing what to do. The issue was what doing it required. The journals had been clinical about it in the way scientists are clinical about things that are actually devastating. The bond completed only through full mutual disclosure, not performance of it, not a curated version of it. The actual truth, withheld from no one and nothing, offered without exit strategy or contingency. Her mother's bloodline carried healing that was not simply a function of blood chemistry. It was a function of connection, of being fully seen by the thing you were bonded to. The blood moon wolves were healer wolves not because their blood contained some biochemical compound, but because their power moved through trust, through the radical and terrifying act of being entirely, completely, unreservedly known. She was, she thought, extremely inconveniently constructed for exactly this requirement. Magnus' eyes were open. He was looking at her. He was still there, still present, still holding, but the frost was spreading and his skin was past cold into something that had no good word for it. "I need you to listen," she said. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to stay with me while I do it."
Can you do that?
He said her name. Just her name. It was enough. She told him everything. Not the version she had told him in pieces over the past 2 weeks. The carefully selected pieces she had offered when she was testing, when she was assessing, when she was still keeping most of herself at a safe and manageable remove. She told him all of it. The shame she had carried since childhood, folded so small and kept so long that she had almost stopped registering it as a weight. The wolf that had never manifested fully, that she had told herself was broken, that she had accepted as proof of her father's central thesis about her, that she was incomplete, that she was less. She told him about the years of believing it, the years of performing wholeness, so consistently that the performance had started to feel like the only real version of herself she had access to. She told him about the books in the wall, about the way she had learned to make herself useful to people who did not want her, because being useful was the only form of belonging available in rooms where she was not wanted. She told him about the specific loneliness of being warm and generous with strangers and completely unable to let anyone close. She told him why she had not been able to stop herself from taking his hand across the tower table, and why it had frightened her, and what she had done with the fright. "I love you," she said. Her voice was steady. She was not performing steadiness. She had come out the other side of the terror of saying it and found, to her own surprise, that the truth of it was something she could stand in. All of me loves all of you. Even the broken parts. Especially the broken parts, maybe because they're the ones that recognized each other. The light happened between them before she had finished the sentence. Not the faint flicker she had felt before, the small warmth she had noticed in these state grounds, in the dining room, in the moment she'd placed her hand over his. Something ancient waking from a long sleep, enormous and unhurried, moving through her bloodline the way a river moves when the ice breaks at the end of a winter that has lasted too long. It moved out of her hands and into him, and she felt it leave not as a loss but as a completion, the sensation of something that had been straining towards somewhere finally arriving. And then she shifted. She had spent 18 years being told that her wolf was broken. She understood now that it had been waiting, not for permission, not for the right circumstances, or the right preparation, or the right anything external. It had been waiting for her to stop withholding herself from it. It had been waiting for her to be all the way present. Silver. She had not expected silver, but apparently her mother's bloodline ran that way. The wolf that came was not the halting, uncertain shape she had always managed before, but something fully realized, something that knew its own dimensions. She shifted and came back to herself almost instantly, the shift lasting only the seconds required to complete what needed completing, and then she was herself again, kneeling on the vault floor, her hands on Magnus' chest. The frost was gone. His skin under her palms was warm. Not body temperature warm. Warm the way fire is warm. Warm the way something that has been cold for a very long time feels when it finally stops being cold. His eyes focused. Fully. He looked at her. "Hello," she said, because she had not prepared anything, and that was what came out. Magnus Hernes, the Midnight Sovereign, the man who had run Northern Packs for 5 years without once showing vulnerability in a room he thought was being watched, reached up and put his hand against her face, and the warmth of it was real and complete and finally, entirely his own. Chapter 9. Petra arrived in the vault doorway with wolves wearing the colors of 3 neutral packs, and she was crying, which was the first time in Julie's memory that Petra had cried about anything that cost her something to cry about. Julie looked at her half-sister, golden-haired, legitimate, carefully maintained in her ignorance, and found that the anger she might have expected to feel was not quite the right shape for the moment. What she felt was more complicated, The specific exhaustion of watching someone do the right thing very late and still count it as the right thing, and the equally specific recognition that late was not the same as never, and that she had spent enough of her life treating those two things as equivalent. Petra had found the journals. Not the vault journals. Those had been locked, but the secondary set, the ones her father had kept in his private study behind the volume of Northern Trade Law that no one had opened in 15 years. She had found them the morning after Julie left, in the particular way of people who have been carefully not looking at something for a long time and wake up one day unable to stop themselves from looking. She had spent 2 days reading. She had sent copies to the neutral packs on the third day. She had been feeding intelligence to Magnus people for 6 weeks before that. Small things, nothing she could explain to herself as significant, the kind of things you tell yourself don't count. And then the journals. The Southern arrangement, Julie said. In custody. All of them. The neutral packs moved yesterday when I sent the last of the documentation. Petra met her eyes. The alliances our father built are dissolved. He has nothing. Julie absorbed this. Outside the vault, she could hear Magnus Wolf's moving Eric Dahlstrom toward a secure location. She could hear her father's voice, still attempting to negotiate, still reaching for leverage, still unable to understand that he had run out of it. She asked to speak to her father alone. Magnus looked at her when she said it. A careful look, the look of someone assessing whether the request was about strategy or something else. She met his eyes steadily until he nodded. The dungeon room was small and cold, and her father sat in it with the posture of a man who had not yet fully accepted that the room was not temporary. He looked up when she entered, and the expression that crossed his face was, briefly, something she had spent 18 years watching for and never seeing, an awareness of her as a person rather than an object to be managed. It lasted approximately 3 seconds before he arranged it into something more useful. Julie, his voice was measured. You've handled this impressively. Regardless of which side you've landed on, that's true. I'm not here for your assessment, she said. She sat down across from him. I want to understand something. Not to forgive you. To close this myself. She asked him about her mother. Not the story she'd been told, the abbreviated version with the accident in it, but the real one. The one she had read in the vault journals and needed confirmed by a human voice before she could fully believe it. He told her. The same clinical detachment as the journals. The prophecy that had been circulating in the Blood Moon communities for a generation, about a child born of the last of the line who would restore it, would carry the power in its full form rather than the diminished forms that had persisted in scattered descendants for 2 centuries. He had known about it before he found Laura. He had found Laura because of it. She knew, Julie said. At the end. She suspected. She traded her freedom for my survival. She bought the only thing she could get with what she had. He said nothing, which was, in its way, the answer. She stood. She had not touched anything in the room. She had not moved toward him. She had sat across the table and looked at the person who had constructed her entire life around his own needs, and she had found, at the bottom of what she'd expected to feel, the fury, the grief, the exhausting, complicated love that does not stop existing simply because you have decided it is not going to save you. She had found something she had not anticipated. Clarity. The simple, cold, particular clarity of a door closing. She placed a hand on her stomach. It was early, very early, too early to feel anything, too early to be certain of anything. But she was certain. The blood moon line doesn't end with me, she said quietly. Not to her father. To the air. To her mother, perhaps, wherever her mother was. It starts again. She walked out of the dungeon into morning light, and she did not look back. Chapter 10. 6 months. 6 months and Ironvale Keep had changed in ways that were not all architectural, though some of them were. The windows in the eastern corridor widened, letting in a light that the stone had not seen in decades. The greenhouse restored, extended, filled with things that bloomed in winter because her mother's botanical knowledge had been the one piece of her heritage she had managed to transmit before everything else was taken. The black throne dismantled and replaced with pale carved wood, not soft, not delicate, but light in a way that the iron it replaced had refused to be. Magnus stood differently now. This was the thing Julie noticed most in the quiet moments of a morning before the day required them to be anything in particular. He stood with the specific ease of someone whose body no longer carried winter in it. Not relaxed, exactly, because he was not a man who relaxed, but present in his own skin in a way he had not been before. His hands were warm. She checked, sometimes still. She suspected she would check for a long time. The assembled packs had come from across the north and the neutral territories, summoned by a formal declaration that had gone out under Magnus' seal and Julie's name simultaneously. The first time those two names had appeared on the same document as partners rather than adversaries, which had caused, she was told, significant commentary in several of the more traditional holds. She had read the commentary. She found it less interesting than she had expected to. She stood before them in the great hall, the same hall where she had stood 6 months ago, and waited to see what would be done with her. The same torches, burning differently somehow, or perhaps she was different, and the light had stayed the same. The same crimson runner. 40 packs assembled instead of 2, because the story had moved through the north the way stories move, when they contain something people recognize as true. Magnus stood at her left. Petra stood at her right, which was not something either of them had planned, and both of them had decided, separately without discussing it, was correct. She did not have a prepared speech. She had tried to prepare one and discarded it on the third draft because it was beginning to sound like a political document, and she had spent enough of her life being a political document. She said what was true instead. The hall was very quiet when she finished. Not the hell-breath quiet of people waiting for a cue, the quiet of people who have heard something true and are sitting with it. Then the alpha of the oldest neutral pack in the north, a woman in her 60s who had been present at the last formal meeting of the Blood Moon Line 40 years ago and had not, apparently, forgotten what that looked like, placed her fist over her heart and bowed her head. The hall followed. Julie stood very still. She had spent 18 years being invisible. She had absolutely no idea what to do with being seen, and she suspected this was going to take a while, and she had decided sometime in the last 6 months that having a while was a different kind of problem than the one she was used to. Later, they stood together at the window of the chamber that had been Magnus' mother's. The forest ran silver with moonlight, that particular silver that belonged specifically to the north in deep winter, when the cold was complete enough to make everything precise. Wolves were running in the dark below, the sounds of them carrying up through the glass, not in warning, not in patrol, but the sound of a pack that was simply, abundantly alive. She leaned back against him and felt the warmth of him at her back and thought about her mother, who had died, so that this moment would be possible. She thought about Lara in a carriage with a sealed letter, knowing what she was carrying, choosing the only trade available to her. She thought about what it meant to receive something that was paid for with someone else's courage. She thought she would spend the rest of her life trying to be worth it. She thought that was exactly the right project. Magnus' arms wrapped around her, his chin resting on her shoulder. His voice was quiet, close to her ear, carrying the specific warmth of someone who had learned how to be warm and was applying the knowledge deliberately. "You came here to begin," he said. There's a difference. She kissed him. In the distance, the howling grew, layered, multiple, joyful in the way that only things that have survived long enough to have something to celebrate know how to be joyful. The Midnight Sovereign had found his queen. The Blood Moon line had come home. And their story, the real one, the one that had nothing to do with what anyone had planned for them, was only just beginning.
If you enjoy watching this story, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.